Hi everyone, Patrick here, and today I'm coming to you from my home because bad weather outside, but don't worry, I will swap out this background so you don't have to watch this IKEA couch all the time. So I already had the chance to put my hands on the GFX100II and on the 55mm f1.7, and as you can see from this image here, I was quite blown away by this experience. Now let me tell you why I was blown away, but first, quick disclaimer. It's not that Fujifilm has given me any gear to test or anything. I have no connections to them. It was just a roadshow, Fujifilm Italy roadshow event at a store about 30 minutes train ride away from my home in the town of Trento, which by the way is a very, very beautiful town with one of the nicest squares in all of Italy, and I will share some clips of Trento throughout this video, so go and visit that city if you are in the area. So Fujifilm Italy had this event. I registered for it about a month ago, and I had no expectation that they already would have the GFX100II and the 55mm f1.7 at the event, but they had, so I could play around with it about 30 minutes total, 20 minutes before lunch break and 10 minutes after lunch break, and that's not a whole lot of time, but it's enough to have some first impressions that I would like to share with you. Now let's start with the GF55mm f1.7. I have some notes down here, so sometimes I will watch down to make sure I don't miss anything, but you can find, as usual, the articles also on FujiRumors, so you can, the link is down below in the description box, so you can check it out there and you can see the samples in higher resolution. Initially, I tested the 55mm on my GFX100S because the 102 was taken, so I did mount it on my 100S and I used it, of course, at f1.7, and it was crazy sharp, but so sharp I kind of was scared to stop down. Maybe it would become too sharp, it would hurt my eyes, I have no idea, just really sharp at f1.7. But the good thing is that if you want to relax your eyes and take a rest from all the sharpness, you just watch a little bit on the side, and then you can enjoy some of the smoothest and most buttery bokeh I've ever seen, like really nice bokeh. So if these are the two main things that you look after in a lens, then you can easily buy the 55mm. The autofocus also was actually quite solid. It might not be on par with the best in the GFX lineup with linear motor, etc., but it was never a frustrating experience. It was actually a quite pleasing experience with the autofocus speed of that lens. And I also made a tracking test, GFX100II with the 55mm, 40 images, 8 frames per second burst, but we'll talk about it later when we talk about the camera. So autofocus is more than okay. I felt it was very confident for a lens without linear motor. Sharpness, excellent. Bokeh, excellent. Now, I didn't have time to test chromatic aberration, for example, but Fujifilm stressed this at the X Summit, that they have designed this lens to contain color fringing as much as possible. I read what they exactly said: reduction of axial chromatic aberration. So they really put an emphasis in the presentation on the fact that it has a very well controlled chromatic aberration. Then I didn't test focus breathing and other things. So if that is important for you, you might have to watch around and wait for other reviews. Two problems of this lens. One is, of course, the super shallow depth of field, and especially when I use it on my GFX100S, it might have focus on the top of the eyelash, and then the pupil is out of focus, and so that's a challenge. Yeah, you have a super shallow depth of field, and that is a problem. So having the best possible autofocus camera helps, and that would be the GFX100II, but I got also dark sharp images with my GFX100S. And I can imagine that with the GFX100II, the hit rate is just higher than with my GFX100S. A second problem is that while I was testing it, like I was watching through a viewfinder and reviewing quickly the images, and I just said, wow, and then wow, and then again, wow. And I was taking pictures of my wife and my son, and then at the third wow, my wife kind of said, true story, she said, but you're not going to buy it, right? And I was like, oh no, just it's a really beautiful lens. No, I'm not going to buy it. And I'm just like, maybe if I sell some other gear, maybe. But so overall, this is an absolutely stellar lens, a fantastic lens, and I can easily recommend it. You will love its image quality, and you love its sharpness wide open. You will get your frustration because of the shallow depth of field to nail perfectly the focus, but that's part of the game now if you have these super fast lenses. And yeah, with that out of the way, now we go into the camera, into the GFX100II. This was clearly beta firmware. I was moving the focus point around in live view or when reviewing the images, and it just wouldn't move. And I clicked like 3 times and nothing happened, and suddenly, boop, the focus point jumped 3 times on the left, on the right, depending on where I was moving it. And so it was super laggy. So when I tell you about the autofocus performance later on, keep in mind this is autofocus performance with beta firmware, beta IBIS, beta autofocus, beta everything, okay? Now what doesn't depend on firmware is of course build quality and ergonomics, and I can easily say that this is the most premium feeling camera that Fujifilm has ever made. Maybe it's not like as premium as a 16-hour hand-polished Leica camera, but for the Fujifilm world, this is the most premium camera they've ever made. And in terms of ergonomics, it feels wonderful in the hands. It's a nice grip, lots of function buttons, easy to press, nice to press. Also a lot of care on the details, for example, the slightly angled top plate that makes it just a little bit easier to read your settings. Next up, dynamic range. Now, I could not test it because I had not really a proper time to make side-by-side comparison with the GFX100S with the same settings. And also, even though I have the raw files of the 102, I cannot open them because I'm on Capture One 22 and I have not upgraded to 23 yet, so I cannot open the raw files. But I did ask the Fujifilm rep who was present at the event what the dynamic range is of the GFX100II, and he told me that compared to the 100S, and he told me that when they received the camera from Japan, they made their own comparisons at Fujifilm Italy, and they saw that there is a dynamic range increase of 1/3 to 2/3 of a stop. Now to the autofocus, I made autofocus tracking tests with a 55mm f1.7, all at f1.7, and with a 45mm 2.8. The settings were 8 fps mechanical shutter, release priority, which means the camera will just take 8 images per second no matter what. You can set it also to focus priority, so if it can, it will take 8 images per second, but if it thinks that it needs more time to properly focus, then it will take less images per second and only fire off when it thinks the image is perfectly in focus. But I wanted to stress test it. I just put it on release priority and I wanted to see the results I get there. The subject was my wife pushing my son in the stroller with a focus on my wife, and then I had boost on autofocus priority and I had face and eye detection enabled. The 55mm was shot wide open at f1.7 all the way. And then there is a setting that I missed to check and to disable, which is IBIS, because this was of course beta firmware and I didn't want IBIS to maybe introduce motion blur in the images. That can happen. I wish I would have disabled that because I was shooting at very fast shutter speeds anyway. IBIS was useless. So with that said, now let's go into the tracking test and into the comparison with the GFX100S. So the first thing that I noticed is that the GFX100II was able to track the face of my wife from much further away than my GFX100S. And I also noticed that I only had an SD UHS 2 card, but the bursts were much longer with the GFX100II compared to my GFX100S. And that's also one of the things that Fujifilm highlighted in their presentation at the X Summit. They said they have now vastly improved the buffer, the internal buffer, up to 128 GB. And also that you can read all the summary of the Fujifilm X Summit event on FujiRumors. The link is down below. So, and that you definitely notice it, even just using a SD card, you will get much longer bursts compared to a GFX100S. So, and now to the results, we have 3 categories. The sharp images, as you can see here, yeah, I crop in and I see it's sharp. And then there were those images that were slightly out of focus and images so that I would still work on them with maybe Topaz Photo IE or so to recover the sharpness and make them still very usable images. And then there are those that for me would just too much out of focus to bother to try to work with them, and I would just delete them. And the results I got are 17 images were perfectly in focus, 11 images were slightly out of focus, and then 12 images were too much out of focus for me. I noticed also that most of the images that were really too much out of focus were those when my wife was most far away to the camera, I would say like 10 meters, 32 feet. The camera needed a while. It was tracking my wife, but it was not really nailing the focus. And when she came a little bit closer, then it started to nail focus. Always better, sometimes slightly out of focus, often also very in focus. So that's, for me, having an almost 50% perfectly focused images, 25% of images slightly out of focus. That's a very good hit rate for a beta firmware with IBIS on and all the settings that I explained to you before. Release priority, not focus priority, etc. This is something I can only dream of on my GFX100S. When I did the test with my GFX100S, initially the 100S wouldn't even track. My wife wouldn't recognize it. And when she got closer, the 100S was more easily distracted by other people in the frame. As I will show you here, is the focus is on the person in the background, and then it jumped back to my wife. And that's something that I never got with the 100S. The 100S always kept the focus on my wife, then sometimes it nailed it perfectly, sometimes not, but it knew the person that it had to track. Now, of course, this is not a scientific test, and it's just my experience, and with the settings that I had with IBIS on, etc. Like I told you before, Fujifilm USA has given some more detailed indication about the accuracy of the camera. They said that compared to the GFX100S, the GFX100II will give you 21% higher focus accuracy in tracking. And I guess this is if you match perfectly the settings, so at 5 FPS each camera. But overall, combine the higher accuracy with the higher frame rates, 8 FPS, with a new algorithm that detects faces from more far away and sticks to the faces more reliably than the GFX100S. If you take it all together and you sum it up, then you really have a significant performance improve on the GFX100II compared to the GFX100S, which means you get just many more keepers with the GFX100II. Would I recommend the GFX100II? Now, if you are like me, if you mostly use it for landscape photography, then probably not, because autofocus is not really that important. Yes, ISO 80 and maybe 1/3, 2/3 of a stop improvement in dynamic range. If that's worth it for you, that's up to you to decide. I feel like the GFX100S has already so much dynamic range, I'm fine with it. The main reason to buy it is probably the autofocus. And you know, I have the X system also, and for whenever autofocus is important, I grab my X-T5 and have no problems with that one. So I feel totally fine with my two systems. Small, portable, compact, great autofocus, X-T5. And then I have the GFX for landscape, best dynamic range, best sharpness and whatever. I feel comfortable with these two systems, but if I would only own a GFX system, then I would upgrade from the GFX100S to the GFX100II just for the autofocus alone. And then, okay, I take also the better dynamic range, but mainly for the autofocus, because that's just better. So that's it as far as my first impression goes. Taking them for what they are, 30 minutes with that new gear. But I think enough to really realize that Fujifilm did give the GFX system a major boost with the GFX100II. I personally will still try to resist to the siren songs of the GFX100II, but I don't know if I can resist to the 55mm f1.7. What a so beautiful lens. How do I explain it to my wife? Help me. So that's it for this video. Wish you an absolutely fantastic day. Goodbye and ciao.